even if they're good reasons.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Professor Greg, for being here. Today we have Professor Greg Dickinson, who's going to talk about the meaning making of museums, the embodied meaning making of museums. He's the chair of Department of Communication Studies. He is an award-winning teacher and scholar. He has received the College of Liberal Art Excellence in Teaching Award and the CSU Alumni Best Teacher Award. He's also received the National Communication Association's Gerald R. Miller Dissertation Award, and with his co-author, the NCA Golden Anniversary Monograph Award. He writes about ways the buildings and human landscapes engage viewers and users on questions, values, beliefs, and actions. His work advances critical and theoretical understanding of memory, place, materiality, and everyday life. He's published in numerous communication, cultural studies, and rhetoric journals on coffee shops, shopping malls, museums, and gentrified urban spaces. His book, Suburban Dreams, Building and Imagining the Good Life, was published by University of Alabama Press in 2015. And he is completing a co-authored book on Buffalo Bill Center of the West. With his co-author, Brian L. Ott, he recently published The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump, and the Rhetoric of White Rage, published in 2019 by Routledge. He is the past editor of Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, a National Communication Association journal. Along with Scott Defiant, Beth Seymour, and Department of Communication Studies, he's the producer of the ACT Human Rights Film Festival. Thank you for being here, and thank you for taking the time to share with us your knowledge that you've had over the course of your career. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for all being here for this conversation. And I'm going to be fairly informal, I hope, and not too long. I also hope if at any moment it feels like too long, just leave. That's totally fine. I want to talk about museums. I want to get there, but I want to take a little time to get there, and I hope in meaningful ways. So one of the reasons of coming to New Zealand is to spend some time with CARE, and partly because one of the things that wasn't mentioned, there was plenty mentioned, is that I'm starting with the help of other people, a Center for Humanities, what we're calling a Center for Engaged Humanities at Colorado State University. And I've been really interested in the ways in which research centers or centers like this can engage with the community. And Mohan Dutta was a speaker at Colorado State University last year in November, maybe it was October, and was really impressed, as I have been for years, with his work. And so I wanted to come hear about what all you were up to. But one of the things that I've learned while I'm here is the importance of giving ourselves some sense of how we got to this place, the long history of getting here. It's easy as a U.S. American who's whatever, I'm here for this reason and we're done, and on we go. And I've begun to learn that we take a little more time. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to do that and use that to get into this conversation about the embodied meaning making of museums. I come from a little tiny town in eastern Washington state called Walla Walla, Washington. The town's so nice they named it twice. It's an Anglicization of a Native American word, of a Cayuse word, meaning multiple things, but at least meaning partly many waters. It's actually quite dry land, but there's a couple of small rivers that come together that eventually end up in the Pacific Ocean, a long ways from this Pacific Ocean. And when I was young, I lived in this town, and there was a small place very close to my home called the Whitman Mission. And this is the homestead of the first Anglo settlers in eastern Washington, the first people who came and stayed for a little bit of time. They were Methodist missionaries. And their purpose, of course, was to try to convert the indigenous folks in eastern Washington to Christianity. This is a story you all know well. And there was a little memorial there that I would go to, and it was a memorial to what was called, when I was a child in 1965, 66, 67, the Whitman Massacre. Because, yes, thank you, because after a couple of years, the indigenous folks did in fact kill Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, and their because they figured out that they suddenly had diseases that they hadn't had before: smallpox, measles. It was destroying their community. So the way that story was told as a young person was as a massacre. Now, today, that story is told somewhat differently in Eastern Washington, but that was kind of my first introduction as a European American to understanding that maybe my story, or the story that I was told, wasn't the only story. And it also, without my knowing, as a 6-year-old, began my interest in memory and in the ways in which memory practices are really important. And again, I'm learning lots here about memory and the importance of memory. So I want to talk about that in just a moment. The second thing I want to say, though, by way of introduction, is that I come from Colorado State University, which is what's called in the U.S. a land grant institution. Those of you who are familiar with U.S. American education might know something about this. Land grant universities were started during the American Civil War by a senator with the last name of Morrill and Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time. And these were universities that were designed to kind of create citizens, but a particular kind of citizen. So they were universities for everybody: practical knowledge, liberal arts education. But what the land grant means is a couple of things. One, that almost all of these institutions were built, and particularly this is true for Colorado State University, on indigenous land. But the second thing is that the initial funds for those universities came from selling land that had been stolen from indigenous people from around the nation. So some of the funds that are the endowment for Colorado State University came from the sale of land in places like Oregon and Washington, where I grew up, but thousands of miles away from Fort Collins, which is where I teach. And so a land grant institution is an institution designed to educate everyday people in the United States, but is founded on, as we like to say in our land acknowledgement, the indelible costs to indigenous folks. So those are some of the ways in which I come here, but think about what we call land acknowledgements in the US. It's a memory practice, a practice of reminding ourselves how it is we came to be where we are. And museums kind of do that kind of work. Okay. So the third thing I want to spend just a little bit of time on is this notion of memory and place that I've devoted some years of my life to writing about. I started writing about these kinds of things in the 1990s. When I say that to my graduate students, they all chuckle because they say, "Ha ha, I wasn't even born then." Appreciate that. But one of the things that seems true to me, and again has been reinforced in my time here, is that we kind of know who we are, or we don't know who we are, in part because of we need to know, or we don't know very well, when we are and where we are. When we are is how we're located in the temporal stream. And where we are means that the location, the kind of physical or material location. You and I just began to have a really interesting conversation about buildings and helping and where women are in buildings in Pakistan, I believe. So our sense of ourselves is rooted in, or is connected to, this sense of where we are and when we are. Memory is one way of figuring out when we are. That is to say that I came to be located at this moment here in New Zealand through a whole series of practices that got me here, that weren't just my own practices. They were also the practices of all sorts of other people. And in telling the stories, Care likes to talk about the narratives. The narratives that we tell are narratives not so much, although sometimes they are, about the future. They're narratives about our past. They're a particular telling of our past. And in bringing a particular telling forward, this telling rather than that telling, we change how we feel about the present moment, but we also make possible imaginings of particular kinds of futures. So when I say when we are, I don't mean, 11:30, 11:20 on Tuesday, the the 23rd. Is that what it is? I've got one of these old-fashioned watches, so I'm going to assume that it's working right. I mean this sense of where I am located in a history and in an imagined future. And so the study of memory practices, at least as it's kind of proceeded in the United States and in European contexts, has been this study of the weaving together of past, present, and future. Let me just say a couple of the things, and then we'll get to this museum work. When we remember something, it's almost always that we remember it because of a present need. You can just think about this in your own personal life. Why did I remember that thing right now? And there probably was something that happened, a smell or an interaction that happened right now. And you're trying to make sense of this present moment. And so we find the thing in the past. We don't at any one moment remember everything. That would be impossible, right? To bring forward all the things all the time. We would be kind of going, we would not well adjust ourselves to the world as it currently is if all the memories are present for us all the time. So memory, even though it looks like it's about the past, is at least about the present, right? It's at least about what concerns I have. And that, I've talked about my own individual memory, but this is true of cultural memory as well. Why are we drawing forth? I was just at Te Pepe down in Wellington. Why are we drawing forth those particular memories at that museum, as complex and as big as it is? Why those memories right now? That becomes a question for a communication scholar, which is what I am. I'm interested in the ways in which communicative stuff engages with audiences. I'm less concerned about what the intention of the designers are. So we're talking about an architect in the building of your case. I intended to do these things, and that matters. But what really matters is what happens to me, what happens when you show up in that space? How does it feel to you when you're in the space? So why that memory right now, and how is that encouraging certain kinds of beliefs, attitudes, or actions? And what futures does that memory help us imagine or make difficult for us to imagine? So again, I think about the work of care and the bringing forth narratives of the marginalized, the margins of the margins. That is not just about telling a different past, but it's also about imagining a different future, right? Or if we keep telling the same stories of the Whitman mission as a place of where there was a massacre rather than there was a conflict, a reasonable conflict, then we're imagining a particular kind of future, right? So these things are really woven together. But same with place. Places become meaningful or sometimes have lack of meaning depending on whether you can sense when they are. So if you think about going to just walking around Palmerston, there are these buildings that can be anywhere because they don't reference this place and they don't have a particular time. The mall with Kmart. I didn't know Kmart still existed. Frankly, it's gone in the US. So that was a little memory moment. Oh, I used to go to Kmart's back in the day. Okay. But a building like this, we just had a conversation, didn't we, Jenny, about how this building came to be. And it's lovely to still have these old, even though it's no longer a department store, this is apparently where people used to take tea when they were here. Am I getting this kind of right? And it feels like I'm located somewhere because there's a historical referentiality to it. So place and time are really deeply woven. Place and time are really deeply woven. And how we imagine how this place might be different depends in part on the different times that we give it, the different time scales. So the last thing I'm going to say about this, and then I'm going to get in more directly into museums, is that in thinking about all that, I'm influenced in particular by a now past feminist economic geographer by the name of Doreen Massey. She did most of her work in Great Britain. She wrote a book called For Space that was published in the mid-2000s. And it's a kind of a theoretical reflection on some of these questions. And she defined space this way. And I really love this definition and have been thinking about it in my time here. She says one of the ways of thinking about space is as I've got to get the exact right word. The coming together, I've got the wrong word here, but I'm going to get to it. It's going to come to me, I'm pretty sure, of stories so far. Space is the confluence of stories so far. It's not that a space, Palmerston North, Massey University, Colorado State University, Walla Walla has a single story. It has multiple stories. And to really begin to understand those spaces is to understand the multiplicity of stories. I got there. Multiplicity of stories so far. All the different stories. And those stories, it's not just that they're different stories running at different time scales. They're short stories, they're long stories, they're stories that are multiple generations back. They're stories about my family showing up in Walla Walla in 1962, 2 years before I'm born. So that's a relatively short story. Although for the US, my story of still returning home to the same home I was raised in, that's a long story in the United States for people like myself. Does that make some sort of sense? So the multiplicity of stories so far, when we think about space as the multiplicity of stories so far, then we can begin to think about what stories do we want to highlight? Which ones do we want to pay attention to as we begin to think about this space? And that also helps us think about what kinds of identities are possible, are safe, what kind of identities are not possible or that are unsafe in the space. Okay. Whew, lots of up there stuff. Okay. So most of what I'm going to do for the rest of the next few minutes is based on this book, The Haunted West, Memory and Commemoration, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, that I've written with my colleagues, Brian Ott and Eric Aoki. We started this project writing about the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in 2002. The book should show up in a few months. So I don't know how good you are at arithmetic, but in my arithmetic, that's 22 years. Now, we've published essays on this project over time, but we've been spending a lot of time at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Now, Buffalo Bill was the most famous person in the Western world in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was a cowboy. He made his, born in Iowa, spent some time in Nebraska, and ended up founding a town in Wyoming. These are all states kind of moving from east to west. Ended up in Wyoming, founding a town after his own name called Cody, Wyoming. He became very famous as an Indian killer. That's the word they use, as a buffalo killer. So buffalo, were the ways in which indigenous folks fed themselves on the plains for a number of generations. And a guy by the name of Ned Buntline started writing little what called dime novels, so you could buy them very inexpensively. He then built a show. Buffalo Bill Cody built a show that wasn't a show, but was real history of the settling of the West. That was the way he told it, and it went around the world, primarily the U.S. and Europe, but it had multiple tours in Europe. It was the only thing for which Queen Victoria left her castle to see, because they couldn't bring the show there because they had all these horses and etc. Okay. So in Cody, Wyoming, they found a museum upon his death in the 1920s. And it now in this small town, maybe it's 5,000, 6,000 people live in Cody, Wyoming. It's the eastern gate of a very large national park called Yellowstone National Park that was founded by Teddy Roosevelt in the 1930s. Okay. So this museum has this complex has 5 museums, kind of around. I don't know if I had a hand that was round, it would make sense. Over here is a Natural History Museum, then the Buffalo Bills Museum, Plains Indian Museum, a museum about Plains Indians, an art museum, the Gallery of Western Art, and then a firearms museum, a museum about guns. So that, yeah. I love that you respond so much. Whoa, what the hell? Why do we have a museum about guns? Well, isn't that kind of American? Okay. In the process, I'll give you some examples from the museum, and I'm happy to talk more about the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. It's very particular, though. So what I want to do for a few minutes is talk about how museums come to do their work as communicative technologies. So here's the thing, at least in the US, museums, especially history museums, are taken very seriously. When surveyed, US Americans will say a history museum is the most reliable way to learn history, even more reliable than talking to my grandparents who actually experienced the thing. Why is that? It's because museums have the material goods of the past, right? That's kind of the fundamental reason. So museums are not taken as just another place. They're taken as like really truthful. As a rhetorician, as a communication person, I'm dubious. I'm not so sure, but what I'm really interested in is how do they come to seem so truthful, and what would they have us believe or think or do? That's my communication perspective. It's different than other people's kind of perspective. It's mine. And so I'm going to talk about some practices, museal practices that lead to that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we experience the spaces in an embodied way. It'll just take a few more minutes. So let me start with this picture. This is a wall in the Guns Museum in Cody, Wyoming. So it's the Cody Firearms Museum, and it was recently redesigned. The Firearms Museum was recently redesigned in the last 4 or 5 years. And so during COVID, my friend Eric Aoki and I got in a car and wore our masks and went up there. It was open with distancing. And we showed up, and one of the things I saw was this big wall filled with these pictures, and it was called The Cost of War. So this is in the Guns Museum, and in the previous version of the Guns Museum, there was no sense whatsoever that guns killed people. They were organized, the guns were often organized by wars because gun technology changed as wars changed, or wars changed as gun technology changed. It's kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing. But there wasn't much acknowledgement that guns actually killed people. So in this museum, they say, oh, there's a cost of war. Notice it doesn't say the cost of guns or the cost of gun violence or the cost of murders or the cost of sexual violence. None of that's the cost of war. So we actually don't see very many guns on this. But I wander around this wall and I ask myself, where do these pictures come from? And they're probably pictures that make the most sense within a US-American context. But, you know, we have pictures that are almost certainly from the First World War here on the far left. We have a military cemetery, right? We have images from POWs, people who've come back from Vietnam in particular, where there's a lot of conversation about POW. The center picture is from Wyoming, just a few miles away from Cody, Wyoming, and it's a picture of one of the internment camps during World War II, where Japanese Americans from the western part of the country were collected into concentration camps, and that's one of the concentration camps. It's an image of one of the concentration camps. Nowhere on this wall does it tell you where these photos came from, what the photos are, who collected them, how they chose them. So I wrote to the museum curator and said, what are these photographs? And the curator says, I don't know. I know, right? That's kind of strange. So I don't know what that is. So I hired a graduate student, and I said to this graduate student, can you figure out where these photos came from? And the graduate student could, in fact, do so. And so we found where all those photos were, and I'm not going to remember where they all came from, but nonetheless. Here's the other thing, is that not only did those photos come from a lot of different places, but those are not the photos as you find them in the archive. They've changed the colors, they've cropped them. They've cropped the photographs, they've changed the colors. Okay, so all of this is meaning making, and when you walk up to you think those are just pictures. In fact, somebody's made a series of decisions. Some of those photographs come from the archives of the museum itself, but most of them do not. So I'm curious then about these practices that lead to how museums come to be made. I can keep going, or if that's too distracting, we can stop and just have a question and answer. We're good? All right.
It's good for mine.
Oh, it's good for, okay. Well, the people online are not being bothered in the least, so it's working out fine. Okay, so the first half of this is, how does the stuff come to be in the archives of a museum in the first place? And that actually frames what a museum can do. And this is something most of us walking into a museum don't necessarily think about. And so we talk about this as collected memory, the ways in which we collect stuff together. And we talk about it in two ways, the collection itself and the preservation. So what are we allowed to collect? And here in New Zealand, you have a similar issue that we have in the US, which is whose people's stuff is collected. And did we ever get permission to collect that stuff? In the US, it has to do in particular with indigenous burial sites, the bones of indigenous people, and the various parts of the cultural heritage. So let me give you a couple. We have something called the Native American grave, and it sounds like you have it. Repatriation Act. That's exactly right. And so part of that had to do with trying to figure out a way to return the remains of Native Americans that had been collected, sometimes by white folks, sometimes by indigenous folks, and then sold to white folks in a whole variety of ways that are the foundational remains of many archaeological and natural history museum collections. But the other piece of this has to do with the various material items that come from indigenous folks and the ways in which those were often taken without permission and are now housed in museums. And they're not doing the thing that they were designed to be done in the first place. Those are a whole series of decisions that get made. I want to spend just a second on preservation just because it's, I don't know, a story that's mostly interesting. It just gets louder and louder.
No, can they pause? Can you tell me just pause for a couple?
Supposed to have been finished by.
So for those online, we've got a little noise going on. I don't know if can they hear Richard? the noise? Yeah, they can, right? Okay. Okay. All right.
But Adrian's gone down to.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm worried about all of you. I'm fine.
Can I ask one?
Yeah,
question?
please
Did
do.
the graduate student find out where the pictures had come from at some point?
Yes. Right. So the graduate student was able to find what archive or place the picture was located in. So maybe it was in a newspaper archive, or it was owned by Getty Images, or yeah. So we were able to find out. Yep.
And now it is sourced in the museum?
No.
No.
No, they don't care.
Oh.
They don't have to put a placard saying what it is about.
Nope. Mm-mm.
Because
They
they
don't.
edited it and changed it.
They edited it, yeah. And in fact, I suspect the museum had almost nothing to do with it. They hired, as museums do, a museum design firm. And the museum design firm built the wall. And so I think like the I'm certain in the Guns Museum, the ways the guns themselves were displayed was very carefully curated by the curator at the time. She's quite famous gun historian. But I think this display was built by a design firm.
They didn't bother.
They didn't bother. No. And I suppose if I really worked hard and tried to find the designer, they might remember, but I doubt it. Yep. Yeah. So let me just talk a little bit about preservation. A number of the things that are held in a number of the items, indigenous items that are held in U.S. American museums, one of the arguments that the archives will say is, well, we're preserving these. But for example, I live close to several of the pueblos in New Mexico, and I drive through there, and so I was kind of interested. And they have a number of pots that they put out around the area whose purpose is to slowly fall apart. That's the point. That's how it's working in their cosmology. So preserving the item is in fact not of interest to the Taos Pueblo people. It may be of interest to myself and to scholars like me. Okay, so So that's one side of this that we're interested in. We don't spend a lot of time as scholars on this because, again, we're interested in the communicative side, but we recognize that what gets collected and what gets preserved and how we think about those things will determine what we're able to say in the museum, what we're actually able to do. So the second part of this is exhibition and representation. Exhibition is the actual showing of the thing, and then the representation is the writing about the thing. So here we have, for example, in the art on the far right, on the art museum, we have a number of just the image of how the art's displayed, how it's shown, how it's exhibited. On the left is a series. This is from the Plains Indian Museum. That's part of this larger collection. And the ways in which they explain the items, the material items that are on display, is in these notebooks that look handwritten. And it's as though I were taking the notes, and I can flip through these notebooks so that I can read more about the various artifacts that have been preserved and exhibited. One of the arguments we make, just for the fun of it, is that those notebooks urge me to take the position of a kind of colonialist archaeologist. That my job is to write notes that tell us the truth about those items. It produces what we call a reverential relationship between the culture we're studying and myself. And that's a distance relationship. It's in some things it's positive. I revere this. I have positive feelings towards this culture. And yet it's distanced from me. And it's distanced in the past, and it's distanced culturally. And so I can feel as though I have positive emotions, but it's not really going to touch me or change me because it's fully in the past. Here's memory that I'm trying not to bring into the present or the future. Does that make some sort of sense? So I've talked about this some. This is just another quick example from my colleague, Micah, who's at Colorado State University. She's an anthropologist of Neanderthals. She studies Neanderthals in Central and Eastern Europe. And there's a collection of bones at Krapina. And those bones are Neanderthal bones. It's one of the most complete collections of Neanderthal bones in the world. And there are a group of scientists from Harvard who want to come and take those bones and do a more complete DNA analysis of the bones so that we know the DNA of Neanderthals. The problem is that to do that, you have to destroy the bones. It's just the process. You take the bones, you grind them up, you use the ground up powder to study the DNA, and that's how you learn the DNA. You can't learn the DNA without destroying the bones. I don't know why, for sure.
I was thinking DNA, especially with PCR.
Yeah.
You can take the tiny bit and amplify it.
I totally believe you. I am well out of my depth as a scientific.
Destroy it.
Yeah, that's what's happened in previous cases where the folks that are doing this have shown up is the bones are mostly or completely destroyed. So these folks don't want to do that because they want to preserve their heritage in this way. But just to make this more complicated, part of the reason that the folks in Croatia want to hang on to these and in other places in Central Europe is because the Russians want to demonstrate that, in fact, human life began in Russia, which is also a colonialist project. So the past is complicated. The way we tell the past is complicated. This is part of what we mean by the multiplicity of stories so far. But notice how the stories we tell are not just the truth, they're motivated. They come from our desires. They come from places that have to do with who we want to be and who we want to become. It's not simply about the past. It's a great question about the actual science. I'll go back to Micah and ask her. Okay. All right. The last thing I'll talk about for a few minutes, this has to do with this conversation we had just before the talk about how it feels to be in having to walk up the steps to talk to my boss. Brian, Eric, and I developed something we call experiential landscapes to try to explain how museums work. And also to say that museums don't just stand alone. They're always part of a larger complex. So, for example, the Buffalo Bills Center of the West is in the middle of Wyoming, and from Fort Collins anyway, it's a 7-hour drive through the West, the U.S. American West, wide open spaces where there are far more antelope and cows than there are humans, and you see cowboys, with their hats on, rustling cows. And, that's part of getting to the Buffalo Bills Center of the West. So that's a piece of it. But we also bring all sorts of stuff with us. We bring beliefs and values and attitudes to the museum. That's part of our experiential landscape as well, the way we already feel, right? And then there's what the museum itself does. So one of the things about going to a museum as compared to reading a book, everything has all of this stuff, but is that there's a sensation. There's the sense of being in a museum, the light, the sound, the feel. In the Natural History Museum, the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, there's a display about forest fires, which is something that we have lots of arguments about in the West. Should we just let them burn? Should we not let them burn? And they pipe in the smell of smoke. That's just interesting. Not making a claim whether it's good or bad. It's just interesting. That you can't do easily with a book. I suppose you could have a scratch and sniff book about forest fires, but even that would be different, right? Rather than walking like, oh, and the light is different. You kind of see the flashing fire, right? So there's a real embodied sense. The second thing is that this experience, I've talked a lot about this already, this experiential landscape in the museum has a temporality. That is to say, when I'm standing looking at the Plains Indian Museum, I'm bringing with me my past, say, of this little tiny museum in Walla Walla that when I was a kid was about how terrible the indigenous people were because they massacred white folks. I'm bringing that with me to this museum. But I'm also bringing with me what I might take out of this museum when I go to the next museum or when I go back to my life when I'm not in the museum as a citizen, as a U.S. American. So temporality is always involved. And this is just true always in our life, that we're never just at a moment. We're in a welter of moments. We're in a complex of moments, right? This moment is future and past and present, all woven together in no particular way, faster or slower. Some days seem like they go so fast and some so short. It's embodied and in place. So I've already begun to talk about this, but this sense that I'm somewhere with somebody. I was just at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, California, with my friend Eric Oki. The Japanese American National Museum, in its current version, started in 1998. And a major part of that display is about the Japanese American internment that I've already talked a little bit about. Eric, I've been to this museum multiple times, and Eric and I are beginning a paper on it. I'm presenting on it at the end of May. And I knew this as well. Eric and I have been friends for 24 years, and I knew that his father was in the internment camp and that his aunties and his grandparents were in concentration camps. But my being at the museum, to which I'd been multiple times before, with Eric, changed my experience of the museum. Eric would circle back with tears in his eyes that I couldn't have because while I knew about the Japanese American experience, I didn't have a father who refused to tell me about it until late in life. But my experience then of the museum is embodied and in place and relational. It depends on who I'm with and under what conditions. But this embodied, and what I've just told you gets to this final point, this embodied sense of how museums, any place, by the way, this is not just museums, is individual and social. My own individual story matters, but that individual sense of how space works, how the past works, how the future is also always social. It's always woven with other people, with the stories other people have told me, with the stories I've told other people, with the sense of what it means, in my case, to be white. Whiteness is not an individual characteristic. That's a thing that I've been asked to be by my society. And a thing that I've willingly said yes to on a regular basis because it's provided privileges for me. right? And so that sense of sensation and temporality and embodiedness is an individual one. Certainly how I respond to a museum is going to be different than every single other person, but not radically different, because we're all social beings. We're all, it's not just that space is a multiplicity of stories so far. We're all multiplicities of stories so far. All right. I'm just going to give you, I think I just have one more example. I'm going to pop ahead here and see. Yeah, okay. I just have a couple more real quick examples. The Plains Indian Museum, just to try to bring some of these pieces together. I want to give you the top two pictures are from two of the displays in this really beautiful Plains Indian Museum is really beautiful. Just a kind of a by the way, the initial collection comes from the Buffalo Bills show. And so rather than being a collection that's primarily pots or bones, it's primarily costumes, because Native American indigenous folks would make costumes for the indigenous folks who were in the show. Every winter they would make the costumes, and then in the summer they would tour with those costumes, and those became the foundation it's just kind of interesting. Anyway, so on the left here is an example of a river home along the Missouri. These river homes were destroyed when they built the dams along the Missouri River going south. That area no longer exists. It's underwater. But this, you would walk in, the light was low, there's a fake fire. You can't smell the fire in this case, but every person who would walk in, I would sit there for a long time, would lean down to see if the fire is working. See how I mean by embodied and sensei. And it's a really compelling, and around the building were these monitors that were telling stories about growing up in the homes, or the homes no longer exist, but we still do what's called in North American Indigenous studies survivance, that sense that white folks have tried to kill us but haven't managed to, and we're still here and we're still thriving. Very compelling embodied. This other one's called the Seasons of Life, and you sit on a stool and you watch a full season happen, and it's slides and video and music and voiceover about life before contact with white folks. It frames winter as the time of contact, that moment we didn't know the bad things that were coming to us, but very compelling. Then finally, this is the 19th century, U.S. American 19th century, called Encounters. This is the time when white folks show up in the plains. Indigenous folks are taken from indigenous babies are taken from their homes to go to boarding schools. It's simply called Encounters, and you can't capture it in a single picture because the wall is long, you're kind of pushed up against it, and it is boring. It's what we call museum in the passive voice. Some bad things happened. Compelling stories about indigenous life that's now gone. Non-compelling stories about indigenous life that still matters. Doing embodied things. This is from the Japanese American National Museum that my buddy Eric and I went to. This is a art piece of the suitcases that people brought with them when they migrated to the U.S. That Japanese brought with them when they migrated to the U.S., but also pieces that they used when they were interned in the concentration camps. And you would see so many people stop at that wall, as I did, kind of an introduction to the museum, and just kind of pause with it and think about, what does that mean? How does that feel? Okay. Now, so the point here is that museums are, in all places really, museums are built out of the past. They try to tell, especially history museums, they try to tell a particular kind of past. They do that because of present needs and to imagine particular futures. They can do that in ways that are liberatory, but frequently, because museums have been a colonial practice, are often told to reinforce colonial practices. So museums come out of colonial practices in the U.S., in Europe, United States. But they draw us in as whole embodied people. They can draw us in as whole embodied people, and therefore make their communication particularly powerful. That's what I have. Thank you, folks. I'm happy to answer questions.
So much. Thank you so much for being so patient with us. It's also part of the embodied.
It's a part of the MBA. Exactly.
Yes, are there any questions? Okay.
Okay.
I did want, oh, no, you go first.
I know you've been meeting very long, but we had time to visit our museum for a few months.
So I was on my way, and I got a WhatsApp from Dr. Dutta saying, "Well, we're going to meet now." So off we went. So I haven't. I wish I did get to Te Papa. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Te Papa is in Wellington.
Yeah, I have gotten there, but I have not gotten to the one here. That's right. Yeah.
You'll enjoy it. It's lovely.
Maybe we could do that
Maybe-
after the talk if we have time.
That's right.
Going to the,
We're from Palmerston.
What?
We're from Palmerston. I'm from Palmerston.
Are you?
Yeah, so we can take that.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah. I yes. I'm on a 5:10 flight. As long as we make that happen, we're good.
I did want to ask you, it's probably a bit naive a question, but you were in the beginning saying that, the museums are taken as more authentic or true representative of the history.
Yep.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I do think it's because of all the things that I just talked about, that there's an actual thing there. If the museum is where the action happened, there's that sense of like I'm in the place the thing happened. That's not really, that's sort of true at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. But I think it's partly because of the material stuff, but it's also the ways in which all of these embodied resources are brought to bear. So I think that we often think about the placards, and people do read the placards, but it's kind of like if you do a museum analysis just of the placards, it's kind of like doing a film analysis that's just a plot summary. Nobody goes to the film for the plot summary. You go to the film because it's edited certain ways and because it sounds certain ways. So I think it's all of those embodied sort of things. And museums have become far more sophisticated. You can speak to this better than I can in drawing all of our senses in the use of sound, in the use of light, in the use of artifacts. So museums often struggle because they don't have the artifacts. So then what do you do if you don't have artifacts to show? But I think it's the sense that I could touch the thing. I mean, it's hidden by glass often. I'm not allowed to, or I'm told I'm not allowed to. But I think a lot of it has to do with that actual material stuff. I see your hand. I just want to say one last thing about that. We've so convinced ourselves that this has changed our life, and I think it has. But part of what it's done, because museum visitorship is up, not down, and it's up. I think now I'm purely speculating. It's up in part because of this,
Yeah.
right? That I want an actual experience with actual stuff and actual people. Right. So I will go look at the museum exhibit online if I have to, but I really want to go see the thing itself. So it's the thingness. That's what I think.
So I'm curious about the penultimate slide, which had the fire. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So my question on the top two slides is to who was involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are these actually authentically made, or does it sort of start to kind of flip into theatre and fabrication to create an experience that actually based on something that's not real?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I think that one of the things with museums is it's almost, well, in this case, it's not an either or. Like, is it authentic or not authentic? The curator, when the museum was redesigned, was Hopi. What's that? You're a Hopi, right? Was Hopi and was trained in museum and history studies. Okay, so but a museum is not made by a person. A museum is made by a whole bunch of people under all sorts of constraints and conditions. So our first reading, our first kind of understanding of things in a museum was fairly negative, to be perfectly honest. And we were pushed to come back and be a little more recognizing of the possible ways in which the museum offered opportunities for, again, in the U.S. American discourse, survivance, narratives of survivance. I don't know if that's part of Indigenous studies here. And I think we were able to see those things. So it's absolutely theater, which also doesn't make it inauthentic, right?
I'm thinking specifically, say, the construction of the teepee.
The teepee, yeah. So it's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. And now, I mean, the book is out here in a few weeks, so I'm not going to go.
See the difference of having
Totally.
the continuing tradition come in.
Totally.
Versus something like made up by theatre designers.
Totally. Yeah. So what I don't know is whether that was a teepee that was used in the late 19th, early 20th century that's been rebuilt there. Was it built of new materials, but by Indigenous folks? I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's a great question. There's a second teepee kind of display in the museum as well that makes more claims of what you're calling authenticity. That is to say, it was a teepee that was used and then was reconstructed there in the museum for the purpose of trying to describe native life on the plains. Now I'm really going to be a rhetorician, a communication person. Authenticity is as much something we do as something has. So museums make claims to authenticity, and that's important. It feels authentic when I'm there. And then there's something like history, like this teepee really was. But even by the time it's in a museum, even if it really was used in 1920, it's now in a museum in 2024. It's now, to me, it starts feeling pretty complicated. Does that make sense? And its purpose is no longer to house people while traveling along with the buffalo. Its purpose certainly has changed dramatically. Yeah.
Interested in this story because it's a sort of authenticity is a wiggly word.
It's such a wiggly word.
It changes over time depending on who you are. So if I looked at two houses at Papua, I look at one that was made quite a few years ago, but with people who came from a certain area, who gathered materials. Relatively recently, and rebuilt something from the past, even though people no longer live in that kind of structure. But authenticity can also be about literally who authors and what degree of control it is. So at least I know that the process meant that people who tribally came from a certain region got to interact with each other and museum people. And they had a degree of control.
Yes.
So, I think those things also affect what's seen. And I think control and authority are key when we look at authenticity.
Agreed. And it may be that authenticity is a word that gets us into as much trouble as not, but things like who has the authority, who's going to author, whose stories, which multiplicity of stories are going to be told, who gets to tell them, who gets to decide. Even if we kind of give up on, well, that's authentic and that's not, that may actually be a bit of a shibboleth, right? I see it often as used as I'm authentic and you're not, or this thing is authentic and that, but as kind of a cudgel, rather than who do we want involved telling the stories in a museum? And I think that's really important, right? And who then is coming to the museum and what are they getting from the museum? Yeah.
That actually brings, to my question.
Yes.
Like in museums, what you talked about Walla Walla as the Whitman and as the story, but the other side of the story. So in museums, do you show, because every story has several angles. Do museums usually show, or the multiple facets, or do they concentrate depending on who is endorsing? Is it more about endorsing?
It's the second, far more than the first. Absolutely. Absolutely. So this work, the work that we've done, is work that tries to point to the specific ways in which this pre-endorsed story gets made compelling, gets made interesting, gets made persuasive. So absolutely. it is this kind of pre-endorsed story. But I think that at least some of the spaces are more complicated than others. So the Buffalo Bill, just in this center alone, the Plains Indian Museum is a complicated place. It primarily, it's complicated in part because audiences are complicated. So let's go there as well. So it's a place that is, as a white person, not really ready to confront my racism, I can go there and do all right. I'm not going to get pushed very hard. It's also a place that, as a person who wants to be more complicated in my understanding as a white person of my relationship to Indigenous life, it has resources for me as well. And it actually, and we have evidence of this, it has resources for Indigenous folks who want a more authentic, honest telling of their life as well. So it's not even just about what's in there, it's about what I bring with it. That's that notion of experiential landscape. So what do I bring with me? That second, what do audiences bring with me? That's the work of a particular kind of communication scholar to kind of think about. We mostly talk about is the message itself the right message? And that's a really important question. But we forget that people always bring their own stuff to the message, regardless of what we want to do with that message. Does that make sense? So I think a place like Buffalo Bill Center of the West is telling a variety of stories, and some places are more complicated than others, provide more opportunities for more audiences to make more, to have more interpretations, where there's a more multiplicity of stories so far. Some places are more closed. So we might call some of those more open texts. They're more open to veiled kinds of interpretations. Some places are more closed. It's really hard to go to the Buffalo Bill Museum in there and really get much of any story other than being a white cowboy is a good thing. Buffalo Bill had kind of a hard life, but that's a pretty certain about what that story is. Yeah. Even in the same place. Yeah.
And linking to what she was saying is who decides which stories get, placed or represented.
That's right.
And then that means some memories are over time erased.
That's right.
And some are brought forward, which,
That's right. Yeah.
So do you talk about memory and narratives? Because I think all the narrative that we have in present is developed based on the narrative, the memories that we are allowed to see or view.
So I haven't used the word narrative as much, but there's no reason why one couldn't, or that I couldn't. I use memory more, and in part it's because I'm looking at places often, and so sometimes narrative pushes us towards kind of a symbolic reading. And what I'm really trying to engage here is the non-symbolic components that are drawing me forward. So narrative has this kind of linearity to it. First this, then it doesn't have to, but certainly the way we tell it does. I start here. Whereas museums aren't always linear in that sort of way. And the feeling I have when I smell the smoke is a little hard to turn into a narrative exactly. So I haven't used narrative a lot. I've used memory more, but you're absolutely right. I've tried to use that language here because that's so important for folks here. Yeah, right. And our narratives are about our past.
Yeah. Because I think all the narratives that are in present, in one way or the other, are shaped by the memories that are made available to us or that we can experience. It was very important.
Yeah.
What memories we can access or we can experience.
That's right. I do want to say that because a memory doesn't show up, isn't obvious, doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's not there at that moment in that place. Right. And so I don't want to be overly determinate, like this museum doesn't tell this story and therefore the memory is gone. It may be repressed. It may be hidden. In fact, when we talk about the Guns Museum, we talk about repression a lot. That just below the surface are all of these other stories, and they're triggers
right? That get us there, but they don't tell the story directly. But that doesn't mean there aren't moments there where I'm like, oh my God, this is bringing up for me all this other stuff. It was the hardest one for the three of us to write about, especially in its original form. It was very kind of uninteresting visually. But I think we were responding to our own worry about guns, the three of us. We had very difficult relationships with firearms, the three of us. And so it was triggering a set of repressed memories for ourselves. So sometimes the memory is not even, it's just pointed to. It's what Slavoj Žižek would call looking awry, where it's just there, just out of the corner of my eye. Yeah.
I was just thinking, you were talking about the museum and the book taking about 22 years.
Yeah.
Work, and like that is a big chunk of someone's life. And you've got this relationship with the other two writers.
Yes, that's right, Brian and Eric.
And then the Plains Indian Museum, and then a lot of even the context of the museum has maybe changed over time, because society, different things are happening now than they were maybe 23 years ago.
Yes.
Some are the same, some are not. So you have a sort of responsibility that goes with your investigation and bringing that into a book form or other forms. And I wondered what you think the effect of your project, which has now become a book, has actually had on those different museums that make up that area, because you've probably got quite a deep dive relationship with those five. And so can you talk a little bit, have you affected things? And what what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You point to some things that are really important that I had to surface, but then you did. It's a long project. My relationship with Eric and Brian, they're friends of mine, co-colleagues. We were at the university together. One of us has moved on to another university. We've changed a lot. So in the book, so we have a series of articles that we publish, but the book, we reflect on our own changes as scholars. We've actually become more humble. And that's really important. It's really easy as a young scholar to I've got the truth about this thing. And it turns out, no. In most cases, it's more complicated. You asked specifically about, has our work affected the museum? So I'll get there by saying, first of all, that one of the things about, if you write about a film, I'm just talking about a communication scholar, once the film is done, it's kind of done, and you can, it doesn't change. Even though it's kind of not very, it feels not permanent, but a film is permanent. Speech, once it's done, that's the speech, right? So that this is out of my, but a museum, it's concrete and constantly changing. It's kind of an irony. It's a kind of a strangeness about the built environment changes more than a speech in the past. It's just a speech in the past. Okay, it's more complicated than that, but that's kind of true. So many of these museums went through redesigns as we were going. One museum got built while we were going, and so when we started the project, it wasn't there at all. It was a hole in the ground. And then two other museums got completely redesigned: the Buffalo Bill Museum and the Plains, the Guns Museum. Another museum is about ready to be redesigned. So they were constantly being changed. I know that the curators have changed over time. We spent some time with them. Again, we're interested in the relationship between the museum and its potential audiences. And I know that they've read our work. We haven't always been positive. We've tried to be fair. And what's interesting in the Guns Museum, the new version of the Guns Museum, whether because we wrote the essay we wrote or not, nobody's told us, but answered many of our questions. Like we talked about how can you have the least interesting visually, the least interesting narratively museum about guns in the West? There must be a repression here. And so we talked about that. And now they made it much more narrative, much more interesting, and they still refuse to think about guns as violence. They just won't do it. They just can't do it, which makes some sense. Who wants to go to a Guns Museum and see a bunch of dead bodies? But that's the fact. It's in America. So I think they've read our work. A museum, you all are, some of you are museum professionals, are scholars. You're trained. So none of this surprises us. But I don't know if there's a paragraph and that showed up in the museum. So, yeah.
It's about perspective, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
about perspective and how convincing you are.
Yeah.
Even museums or anything for that
Anything.
matter.
Yep.
A blank slate is actually better for you to put some perspective and, convince them of something.
Yeah.
But if somebody has an opinion.
Yeah.
To convert that, to change that.
Yeah.
That would take.
Takes a lot.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Would anyone like to do a closing karakia? Oh. So that's why I'm asking if anyone would be willing to do it. Okay, so then we thank you very much for being here. I'll do it in my own language. आपका बहुत शुक्रिया. आपका बहुत शुक्रगुजार हैं कि आप यहाँ आए और आपने हमें वक्त दिया है. हमारे साथ अपना ख्यालात शेयर किए. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. It's lovely.